you'll see all the tweets. So I'll explain that in a minute. My name is Peter Riddle. I work here at the Institute for Government, and until June of last year, I was a journalist for 40 years on the FT and the Times. I'm joined by a panel, which I'll introduce in a minute. This is the first of 4 discussions we're holding in conjunction with Fishburn Hedges, which we are very grateful for not only sponsoring the event, but also very actively been involved in planning the event and setting it up. So we're extremely grateful to them. And we're going to have these 4 sessions. I'll explain what the other ones are going to be at the end. Now, after I've done my introductions, we'll have 5 or 6 minute contributions from the speakers. John Snow's got to go at 1:45 because he's got to do an interview related to what's happening in Cannes today. But we'll end sharply on 2 o'clock. Now, the whole purpose of this series of discussions is to look at the influence of the media, particularly, given we're in the Institute of Government, on government and political decision-making. And we're starting off with a kind of general theme of who really matters. And the wonderful subtitle, Newspapers versus Broadcast versus Social Media. Now, I think possibly I'll immediately challenge that by saying you can't have the versus, because most of us, I mean, John himself is both a broadcaster and involved in social media, blogging, Twittering. Ian Dale is involved as a broadcaster at LBC every evening. Got to listen to it.
7 till 10.
7 till 10. About to get that bit in. He also was one of the pioneer political bloggers. But interestingly, this is a theme which may come out in his remarks, decided not to carry on with what he had been doing on his original blog site and has adopted a different approach. He's also, and I regard this as perhaps one of his most important contributions, a very important political publisher. Indeed, political books really wouldn't exist in the UK at present without Bite Back, his publishing arm. I can say that. I admit my interest as an author, and he's published several of my books, and it's a joy to be published by him. But you wouldn't be reading many political books if it wasn't for Ian. And Jason Lissy, a long-term journalist, we overlapped at the Times many years ago, and is now with Fishburn Hedges, and has seen the perspective from both the conventional writing press and now in the public affairs world, and also from the city. Now, what we're going to start with John, then move to Ian and then Jason. I say 5-6 minute contributions, then we'll open it up for broader discussion to look at these themes of how has the media landscape changed? What does matter more? Is it Twitter more? Is it TV more? I mean, it's very interesting this morning. I've had one of the rolling blogs seeing what's happening in Cannes and what's happening on the Greek debt crisis. It's just a natural input, which would have been impossible to even conceive of 10 or 15 years ago. Which part of the media really holds sway over public opinion and policy making? And do the media influence government as much as they think they do? John.
Well, it's an amazing thing to think that when I started in television, we were still sending silent, wind-up, Bell and Howell cameras to Downing Street to watch the departure of the Prime Minister of the day, in my case, Harold Wilson, to the House of Commons. And indeed, when his pipe burst into flames in his left-hand jacket pocket, it was a silent Bell and Howell camera that caught it. We just weren't expected to shout anything at him, and we didn't. And I think our influence, certainly from a televisual point of view, was fairly limited. Even the fact that we could film the smoke coming out of his pocket, I don't think really in any sense played a vast role in determining government policy. I think the situation has changed absolutely dramatically, and it's changed with the pace of the evolving methodology by which we all operate. And Peter has testified to the reality that if we're going to ask the question, who matters more, television, newspapers, or social network, or the rest of it, the answer is they all matter, and they're all interrelated, and they're all feeding off each other, on each other, and to each other. And the consequence, of course, is that the firestorm of a political event can catch far more readily than it ever has in the past. I mean, God knows how the Profumo affair, which we thought as tender adolescents, some of us that old, was a firestorm, was in fact very slow burning by comparison with what it would have been today. I mean, Profumo wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes. It is just an incredible thing to think now And I mean, of course, James Murdoch has so far survived, but it's very questionable whether he will manage to get through this, and that will be largely due to the stuff that's just tipped out on every conceivable medium, and it's not easy to know necessarily how much of it is true and how much of it isn't. And one of the difficulties, of course, with the instantaneous judgments that appear on various arms of the social network is that so much of it is rumour and very, very difficult to judge. One rumour can very quickly become apparently a fact and then turn out simply not to be true. I certainly will confess that I myself, in the early days of my Twitter activity, got something badly wrong. I said I got informed by somebody at CNN via the social network that Piers Morgan had resigned due to the hacking activities of the Mirror, and it was just completely wrong. It was 100% wrong. I withdrew the tweet within a minute and 36 seconds, but it doesn't matter. By then, it's there, and it's being traded on. And so we're living in dangerous and exciting times. I feel very chastened by that, and I've been infinitely more cautious about what I tweet since. I think the interesting thing is that we're now in a period where people are finding their way through this maze and working out what it is that actually is now important. And I think it's interesting that conventional media are still extraordinarily important. The BBC, ITN, CNN, whatever, the conventional television media, moving pictures, a moment in the day when people watch and all the rest of it, are still surprisingly important. The figures are still very large. I mean, you've still got millions of people watching TV news as their main receptacle. I mean, that's inescapably a fact. But you've got an increasing number of people who are watching on YouTube and on all sorts of other ways and constructing their own sources of moving picture information. So we're not in the same state, I think, as newspapers. I think The Guardian has a very interesting enterprise going on in that, you know, clearly they are now prioritizing the web over the newspaper, and the newspaper is beginning to shrink. It's lost a section, and it will lose more. And the question is whether they can monetize what is being absorbed by many, many millions of people. You know, how many people in this room pay to breach a firewall? I've spoken for long enough, but I only breach one with payment, and that is the FT, simply because it fills a very, very important void in my life. But I would never pay for a newspaper if there's another newspaper that I can more or less get the same service. So I don't do the Times. I wouldn't even do the Guardian, but I would do the Wall Street Journal if the FT died. I mean, which it won't. So I suppose at the end of it all, I would say the media is growing in importance in terms of its effect on government exponentially at a tremendous pace. The politicians are desperately behind the curve. There's a reform going on at the House of Lords at the moment. There is no reference to how the populace will intersect with them on the social network or anything else. There's absolutely no reference whatever to kind of testing opinion or anything like that. All they're interested in is how many of them will manage to stay on any longer. This revolution probably is going too fast for us to pause at the moment to reform anything. We've got to let it bed down. I thought blogging was the great utopia. It is and it isn't. And blogging is withering to some extent. But quality blogging, I would say, is developing, and that is considered posts that occur, you know, not every 3 hours, but perhaps every 3 days. There are people you trust, and Twitter is leading people to good blogs. So you don't have to follow a blog particularly carefully. You need to follow the people who write them. And that is the beauty of Twitter. And I think Twitter so far is and I'll explain it later, but I mean in terms of why I believe this, but I think Twitter is so far a modern miracle. I mean, an absolutely brilliant, brilliant device. And it's not necessarily what you say on Twitter, it's how you lead people to water. And that is fantastic. I've read material in the last 2 years that I would never, ever have read by any other mechanism. I've been led to it by people I trust, and that's the beauty, being able to follow 120, 130 people whose opinions you're interested in, 3 people in Bahrain, 2 in Libya, 4 on Wall Street. Incredible, incredible. And every day your bucket is full of stuff that you want to read.
John, thank you very much indeed. Lots of interesting issues there. Ian.
I agree with John. I mean, I can't think of anything that he said that I would really take issue with, particularly his latter remarks about blogging. As someone who's sort of in almost at the beginning of blogging in this country, I've kind of been rather sad to see that individualistic blogging has certainly declined, I think, over the last 18 months. And I'm still not quite sure why that is. I think part of it is because blogging has kind of been eaten up by the mainstream media, where newspaper editors, broadcast editors decided probably 2007, 2008 that they needed to do something in blogging, and they ordered a lot of their journalists to take up blogging. I don't know how John got involved, whether he was asked to do it or did it voluntarily, but a lot of very...
I was permitted.
You were permitted?
Leave.
Well, there you go.
Let me do anything.
But I think a lot of people were actually instructed to do it, didn't want to do it, but actually rather liked it once they started and saw what it could do for them. And therefore you've got a lot of mainstream media websites, newspaper, BBC, have got a lot of their leading journalists doing it, already big names. They've already got the traffic. They didn't have to build it up because they already had large numbers going to their website anyway. So it's quite difficult nowadays for people who might want to start a blog to attract an audience. Now, the likes of Tim Montgomery, Guido Fawkes, myself, because we were in at the beginning, we could gradually build that audience. But it's much more difficult for sort of Mrs. Miggins, 32 Acacia Avenue, Scunthorpe, to start a blog and get an audience now. And you've also seen a lot of people like me getting out of it for very different reasons. If you looked at the top 20 blogs in 2009, I would say probably 12 to 15 of them no longer exist. And there's no trend there. It's just people's lives move on, their careers take different turns. I decided I couldn't continue with my previous blog when I started on LBC, not particularly for any sort of editorial reasons. I just didn't have the time because most of my writing I did in the evenings. Well, the last thing I want to do after 3 hours on the radio is to start writing blog posts, frankly. So I think you've seen an unfortunate decline in individual blogging, partly also because Twitter has kind of usurped it. Because a lot of media activity nowadays is about spontaneity and reacting to something very quickly. I used to do that on my blog. I now do it on Twitter. It takes less time. You can do it more quickly. There are lots of risks involved in it. I've had similar experiences to John. And the rule is if you get it wrong, admit it immediately and move on. Something politicians might want to learn a lesson from time to time. I mean, spontaneity is a great thing, but it can lead to big, big editorial mistakes. And I suspect anybody in this room who works for a media organisation has had that experience on Twitter or on blogging. But we've now come to an age which I sort of describe as the age of the pundit or the punditocracy, where the pundits are more important to the media than elected politicians. And much as I might like the sound of my own voice on the radio or on the TV, I do sometimes wonder why people like me are used in preference to politicians. Now, I know the reason. It's because the editors think that we might say something interesting, and a backbench politician who wants to climb the greasy pole is not necessarily going to be very controversial. And that's a real challenge for politicians, I think, because otherwise it is the media classes who are going to continue to drive the political agenda. And I think that is largely what happens now. The government is far more apprehensive about what television stations, radio stations, newspapers might do to them than they ever are about any sort of minor backbench rebellion. And indeed, it is the media that often foments these backbench rebellions now. I don't think the European thing last week would not have been as important as it was had certain parts of the media not hyped it up to such an extent. I mean, that's no criticism of anybody that did that. I think television is still the preeminent medium. with radio follow closely behind. You only need to look at the Prime Minister's press conferences to know that, when all of the broadcast journalists are always given the first questions. I mean, if I was the editor, political editor of the Times or the Telegraph or the Guardian, I would sit there seething every time that happened. Because often they have far bigger readerships than many of the political programmes do. We saw that the last general election campaign was dominated by the TV debates, partly because it was the first time they'd happened, but you had sort of the week leading up to the first debate analysing what was going to happen. You then had it. You then had a week sort of looking at what happened and then looking forward to the next one. And there was no policy debate in that election campaign apart from what happened in the TV debates. And I think that's a challenge for the broadcasters next time around to think, well, do we want to do it in this format? I think there's going to be a lot further fragmentation of the media. You're going to find that programmes that exist now or have recently existed, like Andrew Neil's Straight Talk programme, which I thought was a travesty when that was taken off the BBC. It was the only interview programme where you could actually grill a politician or someone for half an hour. And there isn't another programme that does that. It must have been cheap to produce, apart from Andrew Neil's fee, I guess. But, I mean, even so, where do you get that? I mean, John's programme is probably the one, and Newsnight. What's the longest interview you ever do? 10 minutes?
I did half an hour with John le Carré, but that didn't change the world.
Not a politician. So, I mean, I think that there is still a thirst out there for in-depth political interviewing, and I think radio can offer that in a way that television now can't. I'm constantly frustrated by a lot of the, particularly radio news programmes, where the Today programme is probably the primary exponent of this, where you get a 3-minute interview. Just as it's getting going, Jim Naughtie will say, well, that's all we've got time for. Well, why is it? Because they're going bam, 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 so they can get so many stories in, because they think the audience has got the attention span of a flea. And I'm sure that's true to an extent. But where is the rigorous political interview now? Where is sort of the rigorous interview on Newsnight where a politician goes on intending to have a proper discussion rather than being bombarded by Paxman? What does anyone get out of those interviews? So I think you're going to get a fragmentation of the internet trying to step into the breach where the mainstream media has decided, for whatever reason, to go away from it. Now, that will take time. I mean, internet television is really not taken off yet. Internet radio hasn't taken off yet. But I think that day will come, and I think I'm probably over my time.
Thank you very much indeed, Ian. That's fascinating questions you raised, and again, something I'll come back to. Now, Jason, you've mainly worked in the business world. Has the world of Twitter and social networking come to you and your clients now?
Well, I think it's very important. I think the interesting point, firstly, I'll agree with Ian about the punditocracy. And the punditocracy's come to the broadcast media, and it's going in the digital media in the way that it hit newspapers maybe 10 years ago, when you got a proliferation of columnists, usually because they're cheaper than actually having journalists to go out and do research. The pundits would feed off what was ever in the news and fill the pages. And that would create this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy on which people would look at one piece of information and then they'd comment on that and somebody would comment on that. And that has moved on to the online world, and it's all got a lot quicker. What is happening now is somebody will voice an opinion, someone else will put it on, they will tweet their opinion, somebody else will comment on the Twitter, someone will disagree, there'll be comments on blogs that, to be honest, nobody ever reads, and you will continue in this sort of vicious circle where everybody's debating and debating. But this is what I would call a narrow circle, in that in the Westminster Village, amongst the London chattering classes, these things are debated very heavily. What's interesting for me is what's happening out in the real world, what's happening beyond beyond the borders of NW3. What is happening is that real newspaper circulations are dropping for almost every publication in the world, apart from the Daily Mail, which I make no comment about that. It's a comment on what is happening today. And it means that to engage with people in the real world, politicians, businesses, pressure groups, whoever wants to engage with them has to find a new way of engaging with them. And actually, nobody's yet found that way of engaging with them. So they're currently using what is not quite a broken model, but a model that is actually in a certain amount of fracture to go and try and do this communication. Now, there's a few points within that, and I think that we've touched upon the whole point of immediacy over analysis, the fact that people want to get their opinion out quickly rather than necessarily taking time to consider it, and it often means the most shrill voices often steer debate, which is often quite concerning. The other thing that I really, really worry about is the devaluation of scoops. Now, in my day as a newspaper journalist, if you got a good scoop, you had a good 8 or 12 hours ahead of everybody else. It came out at about midnight. The Evening Standard might pick it up in the morning. It might be on the morning papers. It might be on the morning radio news Today programme if you were lucky. And then people would follow it up and it would be followed in the newspaper the next day, the other newspapers the next day. What's happening now is somebody comes out with a scoop, as you found with the Guardian and the hacking debate, for instance. They put out the story, it's tweeted, it's immediately on the website, and within a few minutes, it's tweeted by everybody else. Within half an hour, it's on everybody else's website. So what happens is the newspapers or media organisations don't get any commercial benefit from having invested in the journalists to go out and get the scoop. And this was pointed out when I recently went to a dinner with Alan Rusbridger, and we asked him, said, what commercial value have you got out of the News International hacking scandal? And he said, in terms of newspaper circulation, we had a couple of spikes on the days, but it soon went back to the long-term decline which has been affecting the Guardian. For the website, we've had an increased amount of traffic. Now, the problem with that is the Guardian doesn't charge for their website, and indeed, anybody other than a specialist publication like the FT hasn't succeeded in yet getting people to pay a great deal of money to access their websites. The News International paywall, I would suggest, is probably failing, although I'm sure there's be somebody from News International come up and tell me what a great success it is, but it doesn't appear to be actually reaching the commercial benefit. So therefore, who's going to invest in the stories, these big breaking stories? We haven't talked about Facebook. Now, Facebook is an interesting phenomenon. It has very little influence in the Westminster Village. It has a fair bit of influence for putting together campaigns, and NGOs have been very successful in getting people together on Facebook and using them to mobilise in other areas. And people have been able to mobilise through things like e-petitions. Now, I don't know what people think, but personally I think that the fact that we had a debate about Europe because of an e-petition is an absolute disgrace, because e-petitions are essentially online graffiti. They are,
William Hague.
Well, I'm from Yorkshire and I'm the same age as him, but probably slightly different political hue. But in this case, I do agree with William Hague, because he's a good, solid Yorkshireman. And the fact is that if you put anything up online, you will get people who have a strong opinion. And the majority of people don't really have a strong opinion about Europe, but the people who do will make their shrill voices heard, and that's what happens with an e-petition. 99% of people, if you're a company and you have a Facebook page, you will quite often get activists coming onto that Facebook page and making comments about something that the company does. The fact is 99% of people who come onto your Facebook page are only interested in what flavour of cornflakes you're putting out and whether you're going to get a new line of Twixes. They're not interested in the sourcing of sugar. And that's where the silent majority is not actually, in a sense, it's not being seen, but it's actually probably being heard, because they're ignoring people. Now, I'll finish off with the last couple of points. One is about Twitter, which is the interesting Laura Kuenssberg case about whether you follow the personality or the organisation. And she got 58,000 followers when she was on the BBC. Now, she's transferred over to ITV. She's taken her 58,000 followers. I haven't recently checked whether she's grown it, but I suspect it's not her following is not growing as fast. Now she's on ITV, which doesn't have the same output and strength as the BBC. So who owns the brand? Is it the individual or the organisation? I would suggest at the moment it's still the organisation, but people have an interest in pushing the individual. And finally, newspapers. Peter was paid for many years by newspapers. I was paid for many years by newspapers. I don't want to dismiss the people who gave me food and water, but I think the newspapers are the squeezed middle of this whole debate. And they are in danger of their commercial model is disappearing from beneath them. And maybe we should have a society to save our newspapers, or save the ones we actually want, because the trouble is that some of the newspapers who've been doing the best jobs and doing the best reporting and got the best comment are the ones who are in the most commercial threat.
Thank you very much indeed, Jason. Just before I open it up, just a couple of points raised. The firewall one's very interesting. I mean, I left the Times 16 months ago, just when the firewall was being introduced. And some of my former colleagues, in a sense, expressed frustration at kind of stories being broken behind the firewall, which people aren't noticing. And it's a very interesting dilemma, that, for that. It's one of those things, unless everyone does it, there is what you described. So, can I just ask one point? I'm taking up Jason's last point on the decline of the dead tree press. I'll be the first person to talk about dead trees. It's still agenda setting. When you have your morning conference at Channel 4, John, your producers will be looking at what's been said in the papers, and they'll have heard what's happened on the Today programme. How much is that agenda setting for you in the early decisions of what you're doing with the programme?
Well, no, I think it is being withered. People will have read the papers, but I think we're all being tipped much, much more. I mean, we're getting many, many more diverse tips of things that are going on, and things that are going on in the mainstream. And government is tipping. I mean, there are people illicitly tipping you as well in a way that never happened before. It's so easy to do now. I mean, there's just far, far more information coming out that inform your discussion about what you should do. But there is just one thing I wanted to pick up on, and that's you, Ian. I mean, it's all very well saying you want long-form interviews, but you've got to find people who can give you long-form interviews. I mean, one of the problems is that the modern breed of politicians has been absolutely bred out of having revelatory, interesting conversations about how they're thought. One of the most delicious aspects of the coalition has been the U-turn. That is hope for us all, because at last it means government is actually thinking. Instead of saying we have decided to do X and we will do X, suddenly you get this delicious moment where they say, actually, X wasn't such a good idea, we're not going to do it. And people used to think a U-turn was a very bad thing. Now most people think a U-turn is an incredibly good thing.
But Ian, just come back on that for a second, because I also think you have to find interviewers who are capable of doing long interviews. Because at the moment, you could probably count them on the fingers of one hand. And too often, an interview...
Watch this space on Channel 4, because they are seriously considering a programme of a series of long-form interviews.
Excellent.
It is the problem. Who's going to give you one?
Interestingly, from a business people's point of view, I used to be at Barclays, and John Varley was very media-friendly as the chief executive, until he came up against John Humphreys. And basically, he agreed to do an interview on one subject, and John Humphreys completely ambushed him. And John came out of this interview and said, right, that's it. I've been willing to go out and have these conversations, and I've
on my terms.
yeah. Well, no. To be fair on this point, which is he was willing to take the difficult questions as long as he was able to have the discussion.
He's a grown-up. He's a grown-up. Come on. This is the problem. That's what a long-form interview would do. It would inevitably say, by the way, do you beat your wife?
Yeah, exactly. But the problem was that the first question was, do you beat your wife? And then there wasn't any move off the wife beating question.
Where it doesn't work. That's where the David Frost. I mean, he gets a lot of ridicule, but I think David Frost was one of the best interviewers in British television, because he would spend 20 minutes sort of bowling a few softballs, and then towards the end of the view, once the person had relaxed, then you get your news story. Yeah. And I think a conversation rather than an interview actually often elicits far more from a politician than this constant haranguing. I mean, but just put yourself, it's human reaction. If you feel that someone thinks you're lying or is aggressive to you the whole time, you are going to clam up. It is as simple as that.
Well, admittedly, it's going to be on More 4, but I've done a 45-minute interview with Jimmy Carter live on the stage of the Royal Festival Hall, and that's going out on More 4 in full long form. But that's the 27th of November. I urge you to watch it.
Absolutely, and you can always do catch-up too. Just one thing before I open it up to Ian. You mentioned that you were one of the pioneers of blogging, and you and I had this discussion in the past. One response to blogging is not the original blogs, which on the whole were very, very good, you know, what you and Tim Montgomery were doing, but some of the comments on the blogs. Did you feel you unleashed dark forces from bed sitting rooms around the country?
As somebody said, most people don't read comments on blogs. And I mean, I was conscious that, when I started my blog, anyone could comment, they could do it anonymously and say what they liked. But you only needed one person to effectively break the rules and start swearing, start insulting, and it would then often descend into absolute chaos, and it was vicious chaos. So I then introduced moderation, but then of course that inhibits the debate, because if people want to have a debate with each other online, they want to do it instantaneously. They don't want to wait until I or somebody else has looked at the comment, seen it's okay and pressed approve. So it's a very difficult balance to strike. No one has got it right. I mean, you look at some of the comments that appear on the Guardian or the Telegraph websites, and you think, well, we live in the country of nutters. I'm not allowed to say that word anymore, am I? But I just did. But the internet can be a very, very ugly place. It can be a very ugly place on Twitter as well, increasingly nowadays. And I mean, if you do get into the situation where you make an error of the kind that John's described and the kind that I've done, I mean, it really is a horrible place to be. And you can say, okay, well, you brought it on yourselves.
Well, that's not new, Ian. I mean, the newspapers, I mean, I don't actually really think of them as newspapers, they are sold as newspapers, have been a horrible place to be for a very long time. Some absolute filth turns out in some of the newspapers. Some of it not true. I mean, you've got the Carol Kaplan case, yes?
But not from their readers. These are readers leaving comments.
Well, readers are encouraging this behaviour.
Yeah, but John, on that, one thing, and which I felt one of the problems, I mean, because most newspaper journalists, and it's true of myself in my last 2 years, were at least a third of their time was doing blogging and stuff on the online site. Time, because one thing, you know, dreadful things appear in papers, there's an interval. There's an interval for thought. There isn't an interval for thought. Clearly on Twitter, as you said, that's why mistakes, you know.
And there isn't in television too. I mean, you know, when I first started working in television, you had that glorious 3 hours whilst the stuff was being bathed in the chemical. You could actually make some phone calls. I mean, now you can do a quick scan through Google, get about 6 points, some of which may have no verification whatever, then write your piece. And hey presto, it's on the air 14 minutes after you shot it.
Right, well, let me open up to questions. I'm sure we'll have a lot. I know who some of you are, but if you could say who you are. Right at the back, gentleman at the back.
John Corrible, County Councils Network. A fairly predictable question from me. The relative balance of power between social broadcast and print media. As goes national media, so goes local media, or different dynamic?
Good point. We'll group them together, absolutely. Yep, gentleman there.
Hello, my name is Bernard Hughes from UKR Property Company. Can I ask about the power of Metro, the free sheet, because I see Metro being read by half the people on my tube in the morning.
Very good point. And Brian Walker there.
Brian Walker, Constitution Unit, formerly BBC editor of political programmes. I was just looking at some interesting evidence that Claire Enders of Enders Analysis submitted to the Levinson inquiry about newspapers. One was that almost 10 million people still see a newspaper every day despite decline. That decline, however, is going to accelerate by about another 7.5% to 2015. It's already gone down 25%, I think, to 2005. While there's a shift onto the web by the mainstream media to a considerable extent, people take 40 minutes to read a newspaper, apparently, but 2 minutes 20 is the average online. Where is length going to come in text? We talked about it in television. That's one problem. Secondly, what about the model then for the kind of website that might be the future? I wonder, regardless of its opinions, whether Conservative Home is one, because it aggregates the media, it's fair, it's unfair, and it has a big backer in the name of Lord Ashcroft. Might that be a model? Finally, how does the government reply? The parties are now saying they're trying to seize the initiative to prevent the biased newspapers seizing the agenda by out-tweeting them. Is this the way ahead, and how does the government reply to this without turning spin into a vortex?
Well, that's as always. Thanks very much. Jason.
Well, the local newspapers and the Metro question are quite similar questions because the problem is that people are not willing to pay for media. And this is a very, very major problem. It's a major problem for local newspapers because they can't get people to pay up for them to do their job. And local authorities decided to try and step into this and fund local newspapers. And obviously there was that whole issue about whether there was bias and stuff like that. Now, what we've got in the local media is that you've got a gap between what is needed and what can be delivered. And you've got a gap between the conventional media, which is in very serious decline because people aren't paying for it. You get the free sheets, but the advertising at the moment isn't there. Whether they can keep it up is another question. Whether they will keep local councils to account, whether people want to read that is another question. And the rise of local websites. Now, local websites have not yet reached any situation where they're actually having any great influence. They're starting in some areas like SE1 and the website which is very strong. There's a couple of strong ones in North London. There's a very good one in Leeds, very good one in Brighton. But these are coming up. I think what you will find if we came back here in 10 years' time that the local websites will be very, very influential. On Metro, I think you're absolutely right. People aren't paying for it. I think what we'll find fairly soon is that the Lebedevs will make the Independent go free, and they will try and see whether a quality paper can actually compete against Metro. But I suspect Metro's got too much of a foothold, and Metro is sort of completely sort of fast food media, and no articles are of any length. There's no real analysis. Thankfully, there's very few columnists, and I think it's a good publication. I think it's a useful publication. It's not a particularly good publication, unfortunately. Last thing I was going to say is about the decline of newspapers and websites. Do you know, I'm sure everybody knows which are the two most successful English language news websites in the world, the two fastest growing ones. And they're diametrically different, and they're both British. One is the BBC, and one is the Daily Mail. Now, what the Daily Mail's model is incredible, that it's giving gossip. It says, we'll give you this gossip, and there's some serious stuff over there. So you can have a bit of serious stuff, and you can have a bit of gossip, and you can mix it about. Now, whether you agree with, whether you want this, it damn well works.
Just before I go on, I should mention, we're already tweeting behind me. I haven't got eyes in the back of my head, but it's tweeting at IFG events, at Fishburn Hedges, or at #media and gov, for those actively encouraged to tweet. Ian.
Said with utter contempt, wasn't it?
No, not said with contempt at all. Said with kind of awestruck wonder at the brave new world which we have to deal with.
Local media, I think it is a crying shame, the decline of local media in this country, and I think it is partly due to the way that broadcasting is regulated. You look at other countries and it hasn't happened. You have in the United States, I don't know what level of regulation there is on local media, but as Jeremy Hunt constantly says, why do you have 20 TV stations in Birmingham, Alabama, and sort of none in Birmingham, England? Now, there has to be something wrong with the system that does not allow people to start up their own TV stations. And I think that's going to be a big source of debate over the next few years, because ITV have basically pulled out of local news to any meaningful extent, which I think is a terrible shame. The BBC is running down its local news bulletins, its local radio. And that presents a real opportunity for some of the local newspaper groups who I think have got to stop seeing themselves as newspapers. They've got to see themselves as providers of local news, local entertainment and all the rest. Some are doing it, some aren't. It's very cheap to set up an internet TV studio. I don't understand why most of the local newspaper groups aren't doing that in their own areas, because they've got virtually nothing to compete against now. So I think actually that over time, we will see the rebirth of local news provision in a way that we can't probably comprehend at the moment. The decline of newspapers, I mean, everyone goes from their own experience, don't they? I have a subscription to the Times online, the Telegraph online, but do I really look at them every day? No, I don't. I might look at the Times if I hear of a story, if I've seen it on Twitter, that there is a story that I might want to read in the Times, and I'll click on it, and I've paid my £2 a week automatically. But I probably don't look at it more than 4 times a month. I mean, it's not really worth it. I don't...
You pay it, or does LBC pay it?
I pay it, thank you.
So when you review your expenditure next year, you'll probably dump them, won't you?
I probably will dump it. And I will also dump the I have an iPad, which I hate. I hardly ever use the Telegraph iPad app, even though it's actually quite good, because I'm of an age where I still like reading newspapers. But people 20 years younger than me will not do that. And when you hear stories of media studies students where there's 30 students in a class and only one buys a newspaper every day, well, if they're not going to buy newspapers, frankly, who is? And the challenge for the newspaper industry is to think how to overcome that. Now, The Guardian, I think, were ahead of the game. They then had a dip, and I think they're now ahead of the game again. They're now integrating The Guardian into Facebook. And, I mean, The Guardian articles are dotted all over Facebook now, people who've read them and then recommend them to their friends.
Nobody pays for them. If you give the Guardian gives away its whole content for free, it's got no business. Its business model is bankrupting itself.
At some point,
It made
is that they will be able to charge proper advertising rates. At some point, maybe we haven't reached that yet.
John.
well, I think the question that intrigued me most was the local, and I think the local is easily answered, to be absolutely honest. I mean, local media has been in crisis for a long time, and not as a victim of whatever's happening on the web, but because actually the local is hamstrung by the central. This is the most centralised state in Western Europe, and consequently the local is not very interesting, because you know very well that you are not going to have any impact. What happened? You are completely at the beck and call of the central. And that makes very boring reading. I mean, you can yell about your local resources and facilities, but actually it's a consequence of a decision made by the Department of the Environment or whatever it is. And until the local wake up and seize power from the central, then the local media is not going to be able to have much... I'd like to see the local really leading the attack on the central, but that's not going to happen because nobody reads it, and nobody's following any local websites of any note, bar the obvious exceptions that you identified. And local radio withers. Local commercial radio can't make a fist of local news. It just is. There isn't any local news because all the local is affected by the central. And until the Institute of Government sorts out the way in which this country is run, it's going to be the state of affairs. Now, on the question of the Metro, I mean, given the money the Metro manages to make, it deserves to be a better paper. It is crap. And that'll
That's a technical phrase we use in the media.
It's a Cyrillic sort of reference. And finally, the wonderful question, which I agree we should have a seminar on, from Brian. The last bit of it is the bit which interests me most, and that is how government really does respond to the social network. Are we going to be caught in a vortex or not? I'm not sure that anyone in government has enough time to do what there would have to be done to play the game. And are you actually going to employ press officers to really go wild? Because that's what would have to happen. And we're all much wilder on the web than we are on the telly. And I suspect the press officer would be much wilder on the web than they would be in press releases. So it's a bit of a sort of dodgy one.
Yeah, just before the next round of questions, I mean, I think a very interesting point raised on Metro. The point about it is it doesn't invest in journalism. The Indie does. And the interesting question, an interesting point about the Standard is the Standard has carried on investing in journalism, admittedly on a much smaller scale than it used to, but it still does. The Metro is essentially what in the old-fashioned days was called a wire service put together. I mean, there's no character or personality to it. I think that's the challenge. I mean, that's people pick it up free and then leave it on the tube as one sees, but there's no more lasting thing than that. Sue.
Thank you. I'm Sue. Just a few things that I think it's worth underlining. John mentioned this in the early part of what he was talking about. But the numbers that we're talking about here are quite interesting. So if you look at the average audience for the BBC's News at 10, it's 4.6 million. on every weekday night. Now, that's a very, very healthy audience. If you add to that the 2.5 million or so that ITV News get at 10, John's 800,000, you know, you've got a lot of people who are still watching and getting most of their news from those kind of traditional programmes. The BBC News across the board reaches 80% of UK adults. Now, you know, that's across all our platforms, so it's TV, radio and online. What is the most watched news programme, do you think, that the BBC does? It's actually the 6:30 regional news. If you add up everybody who is watching their 6:30 regional news, it is the biggest news programme we do. So I think we just need to get into proportions. I think it was Ian who raised the issue of the PM's debates in the last election. 2.5 million people watched all of those debates. That is 4.5 hours of television was watched by 2.5 million people, and that was all policy discussion. Over 22 million people watched some of the debates, and the really gratifying thing about it was that a lot of those people were actually in the 18 to 24 age group that we all find it so difficult to get to. And look at the turnout increase in voting in the 2010 election. The growth in turnout was actually higher amongst that age group. And certainly anecdotally, all the experience that we had with it was that that was the age group that was using social media to discuss what they were watching on television. So there is this kind of circular arrangement here, if you like. Jason raised the issue of Laura Kuenssberg's 60,000 followers, which she took with her when she so tragically left. Those were basically followers who were following her when she was on the BBC News Channel as a political correspondent. That is, you know, that is how that kind of, program works. So none of this is, if you like, completely, you can't just chop it up. It is all part of what is the current media, the way that the media works.
Well, yeah, I mean, we'll have a couple more. Gentleman at the back, and then, yeah.
Roger Dweck, civil servant, now Better Government Initiative executive. I'm interested in views you may have on the total impact of all of this on government. Jason used the term immediacy over analysis, and it's arguable that that applies to governments, successive governments today. The need to respond rapidly to all these forms of media and get out headlines quickly ahead of careful policy analysis.
Right, thank you, Roger. Yes, a very interesting point. And there's a gentleman there, then I'll bring back the panel.
Thank you. Johns, just one quick point. I think the screen behind you is the death knell for Chatham House rules, by the way. I love the idea of Twitter as being the new utopia. I follow many people, as many people here do. I follow people in this room, many of whom send me pictures of them on their run with their dog, tell me about what they are having to eat or playing Scrabble with their children. There's a lot on Twitter which is just twitting. And the question for Jason really is how much pressure does he see from business people to use channels such as Twitter because they're fashionable rather than because they're right as a communication channel?
Three questions, starting with you, John.
Well, just to come up with the last question first. First of all, you never need to know what any of these people have had for breakfast or what the name of their dog is or how ill it is ever again, because you can just unfollow them. And if they get really persistent, you can just block them. That's the gorgeous thing about Twitter. And it's not true of Facebook. And the point about Twitter, I still argue, is about what it leads you to. And that, I mean, I was coming out of Haiti the other day. I read a really interesting piece on why aid isn't working in Haiti in Atlantic Monthly on the plane. And I tweeted, if you want to know why aid has failed in Haiti, read this article. And there's the URL. And good old Twitter, you don't even have to bit-link the URL, it does it automatically. So you don't lose a whole lot of characters. You can say a lot in 130 characters and still leave 10 for the shrunk URL. So that's a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant thing. As to Sue, well, I mean, the quick thing I would say is, first of all, we also have 4+1, so actually we're over 1 million every night. Important to say. More important, this really is where I think we are mistaken if we go down this track of believing that information is going to become more ephemeral, more superficial. What is happening is very interesting in that we have the highest terrestrial demographic of 18 to 24-year-olds watching Channel 4 News. That is the highest of any terrestrial news program. And if I go to a university campus, I am rewarded by meeting people who absolutely do watch our program. And that is rare. Now, why are they watching something that's in depth? What a bore. Well, the fact is they're watching it before they go out and get pissed, but that's beside the point. But
Does that apply to presenters too?
No, fully sober. But I think I've unfortunately now got to fly. But the only thing I would say is that I think we're on a journey. We don't know where it will end. We will monetize what we do. You can criticize The Guardian and the rest. The fact is The Guardian has started to make not enough money, but some money from advertising. And we will crack it. I have an analogy. Anybody who's seen the greatest documentary of recent years, Man on Wire, this is a fantastic documentary because it's an allegory for us all. Twin Towers, mad tightrope walker living in France, decides he's going to climb them. This is before they came down, of course. Right, he's got no tightrope. He has never seen the Twin Towers, never been to New York. He goes to New York, he gets a tightrope, somehow gets up, and they manage to put it across. The only thing he forgot to do was to bring a movie cameraman to record it. But, of course, there were lots of stills, and there was lots of evidence from the ground that he actually really did do it. And I simply say the old media, us, the BBC, the rest of it, are in one tower, and Google and Yahoo and all the rest of them are in the other tower. They need us at least as much as we need them. We keep forgetting the adage which was coined right at the beginning of this revolution, which was that the internet is about content, content, content. And as you, sir, in the glasses, have so brilliantly exemplified, if it's crap, you won't want it. It's got to have content, and we can provide quality content, and that's why, despite the doommongers who have left the fray to go and play with the lobbyists and the rest of it, the fact is we will survive, and we will prosper, because we'll get a tightrope across to that tower, and they'll be as keen to come back across it as we are to go to them. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I want to sing Land of Hope and Glory now.
The great thing is here, at IFG events, you have two finales. We've had one, and now we're going to move on to the second. Now, Ian, very interesting point Roger Dawell raised, which was about the impact on government, the immediacy, rather than reflection, the sense of people feel they've got to react. And you mentioned very interestingly the impact on the European vote of 10 days ago, particularly obviously in Conservative Home, and as well as what was being said in the Mail and the Sun on that. Is there a sense that the blogging and so on and tweeting are having an impact on government?
To an extent. I think if you look at the Liam Fox resignation, the media were constantly wanting an immediate reaction to any of the events that happened during that. And I remember thinking that I was at the Frankfurt Book Fair while all this was going on, and I remember thinking, thank God I haven't got my blog anymore, because I know what would have happened. If I hadn't responded with something within about 5 minutes of some major development, I would have had people leaving comments saying, "Oh, you're quiet then. You'd have been commenting if it had been sort of Peter Mandelson sort of under fire, wouldn't you?" But I mean, the fact of the matter is that sometimes people on the internet, probably newspaper columnists, actually haven't got anything to say, or haven't got anything of interest to say. And sometimes, you know, government hasn't got anything of interest to say, and they're pushed into saying something because of the media clamour. And inevitably in those situations, it probably dig themselves a deeper hole than they were in already. So yes, I see Alan here, who will probably, who's worked in government quite a lot, will probably relate to this. So there's constant clamour for a reaction from the media, but when you give a reaction, it then provokes more questions, and you can get yourself into a bigger hole than you were before. Can I just respond to Sue? Because
yeah,
I wasn't criticising the debates, far from it. I thought it was fantastic that they happened. My only thought was it healthy for the election campaign to have three, sort of one a week? Would it not be better next time to maybe have one at the beginning and one at the end, and try and sort of let the campaign blossom in the middle in some way? I haven't got the answer, but I kind of thought they were so dominant last time. Maybe it was because it was the first time. There was probably an element of that. But I thought in some ways, yes, they did get people talking in the way that you described, but maybe in every campaign that would lead to a certain amount of sterility. And on the regional news point, it was really ITV Regional News that I was having a go at, because I think, I mean, they're not news bulletins. If they've got a cat stuck up a tree, that will be the #1 story, as opposed to, in Kent, say, sort of a new development on Boris Island. You will always get the human interest story at the top of the news bulletin. And that's why I think the ITV bulletins don't work. Wouldn't accuse the BBC of that, so.
Jason, a very interesting question asked about impact on business. I mean, you gave the example earlier from your time at Barclays with John Varley. More and more generally, is there any sense of business feeling either a need or a desire to interact with Twitter, social media?
Yes, and the reason is to not quite bypass the media, but to have an additional channel, because business often finds it quite difficult to find ways of actually communicating with its actual customers in a way that is actually meaningful. And so therefore they use Facebook pages and Twitter actually as a way of trying to get some sort of gauge of what their customers are actually thinking, because at times, and I don't want to criticize the media, which I was there for a long time, at times the media doesn't necessarily reflect the general population's views. Going back to this whole thing of feeding off each other, the media tends to reflect what the media is thinking rather than necessarily what the people are thinking. Can I just add a point about the election debates? And I don't know whether this is a failure of the election debates or the failure of the commentators, but I kept finding at the end of the election debates being told how fantastic Nick Clegg had done and how he was a marvellous statesman, he was brilliant, he could have been the next Prime Minister if only he wasn't a Lib Dem. And then I came to the polls came and the Lib Dems did badly. Now, either the people weren't taking it in or people were wrongly analysing it. I don't know quite what was wrong, but something was not connecting.
The media attacked him furiously.
Yeah. Right, gentleman there.
Hello, I'm Tim Lefroy from the Advertising Association. I'd be interested to hear your views on forum special groups and their effect on policymakers. I'm thinking of groups like Mumsnet, who seem to be very much, at the heart of policy debate, and also the role of very high-speed campaigning activity. I mean, the end of the News of the World was precipitated by social media campaign attacking the major advertisers, going to the chief execs of the major advertisers and saying, "Get your ads out of that newspaper," provoking quite a strong reaction. So I'd be interested in your views on the use.
I mean, the internet is a fantastic campaigning tool. You were denigrating e-petitions. I think e-petitions, if they have an end result, can be a fantastic medium for putting pressure on politicians. They got this one wrong because they put the threshold too low. I mean, most of us could probably drum up support of a good few thousand people for any cause that we happen to believe in. It should have been at 1 million, and that would be a real test of public opinion. And I think they probably will put it up. To be fair to them, they did say this was an experiment, and they might have to change it in the future. That's what they should change. But any business, any campaigning group who uses social media, blogging, particularly Twitter to good effect, will, I think, probably do better than if they don't. I'll give you an example of a good example of customer relations. Vodafone, who I have my phone with, I got a bill for £5,000 from Vodafone, which kind of made me think, oh. And I tweeted about it. I said, oh my God, look at this. This is what happened. How on earth do I sort this out? Well, Vodafone have a customer relations team on Twitter. Within 10 minutes, they had direct messaged me saying, look, what's the problem? Tell us and we'll sort it out. And it took a month, and they did sort it out. Now, people said, oh, yeah, but that's because they know that you're in the media, that you go on Sky and all the rest of it. They treated you as a special case. I'd like to think they didn't, and that they would have done that for anyone. But I don't know. I've had that happen on several occasions with
So how did they sort it out?
They sorted it. I mean, we couldn't get to the bottom of what had happened, and still to this day we're not quite sure, but I think it was because I had downloaded a new Twitter application, which was trying to update every second of every day. And therefore, now...
So you didn't know the money, that's why. You didn't have to pay.
No, I didn't have to pay them anything. I mean, when we moved offices, my magazine, and British Telecom, as usual when I move office, completely buggered it up. We were without phones for a long time. I tweeted about it. 30 minutes later, the chairman of the BT came on, or his office came on the line and said, tell us about it, we'll sort it out, and they did. Now,
but the thing
that was a result.
I think it's a very simple thing there. You get Ian on your side and you're made.
But also, if I have a good customer service experience, I will also tweet about that, because I'm fed up with people who just whinge about these things. If you have a good experience, tell people about it.
Jason, I mean, how much do your clients, would they respond? I mean, the very interesting point made on what happened in News of the World in July. If there was a campaign like that.
I think... Oh, God.
You've got yourself in for it, You brought to the... We'll have an advice service outside.
I think there's two points. I've sort of forgotten your question in that. But there's a couple of points, which is going back to what I'm saying was saying before about using social media to get closer to your customers. And a lot of these people who are responding on Twitter, the good organisations that are doing it right, people like Vodafone, O2, British Airways, people like that who've now got dedicated Twitter teams to follow, to do customer service. But it costs a fortune, absolute fortune to do it. They have to have scores of people sitting there following up and trying to work out who's influential like Ian Dale and who's not like Dermot.
You may have some weight.
But the point about the campaigning is there was a lot of campaigning going directly to companies during the News of the World situation. And that was a way of the companies getting a gauge of what their customers were thinking. Now, this was a concerted campaign. Now, was it really what the customers were thinking, or was it not? Was it the conscience of chief executives being pricked because they knew what what people were saying, or was it them saying, right, we're going to take a moral position? The interesting thing was I went for a drink with some media buyers not so long ago, and they told me all the money that got moved from the News of the World just went to other places in News International, because all of these guys had long-term contracts with News International. They just moved it to a different part of the News International. So Murdoch didn't actually lose out at all on the revenue in the short term. But the thing is that politicians and business people who do not listen to what people are saying online do it at their peril. They may have to skew what's it's saying. They will almost certainly not want to listen directly to what's saying, because there will be shrill voices. There will be people trying to push their interests. But if they don't pay attention, it's the direct form that they're getting, that they're not getting through conventional media.
Well, in a way, it comes back to opportunity versus threat, doesn't it? Businesses tend to view the internet as a threat. They're frightened of it, they're frightened of blogs, they're frightened of Twitter. But if you actually turn it around and think, well, what are the opportunities here? How can we actually use this to our own advantage? Do we have a chief executive who could actually tweet by himself without somebody vetting it first? How can we use the internet to humanise our business so we don't look like we're sort of corporate rascals all the time? And the companies that decide to use it as an opportunity tend to be the ones that succeed. I remember saying to Francis Maude when he was Conservative Party chairman, when I was having a real go at him about the absolutely ridiculous state of the Conservative Party website and their lack of communication with anyone on the internet. I said, you've got to stop being frightened of it. You've got to accept that there will be times when the internet doesn't do something that you would like it to. You can't control it. You can't control the message in the way that you can with your MPs. And it was only when they started to realise that, too late before the last election. I mean, they introduced lots of new innovations, but only with 9 months to go, which was too late to really have an impact. And political parties act in exactly the same way as businesses do, and they're always on the defensive. And you can understand it, but they've kind of got to break out of that mindset.
Could I just, before we move on to a couple more questions, just respond to actually 2 points. You mentioned Mumsnet. They're wonderful self-publicists. But there's a great interesting problem for anyone in decision-making position is, who do they represent? And I think one of the dilemmas, I mean, it goes back actually to Roger Dawes' question too, on immediacy. A lot of noise can be made, but who's actually speaking for it? And I think that's a real dilemma that people, and it's the same with e-petitions. I mean, e-petitions is easier to say, hold on, it measures volume rather than anything else. But on some high-profile organisations, you do think, well, okay, what lies below it? And on the immediacy thing, we ran some seminars here, Joe Ratto's in the front here, which it's on our website, some seminars with people from government information, ex-government information, some of them now in the private sector, on what ministers look at, who are terribly traditionally minded. What emerged was a picture of ministers and a lot of civil servants. And this is admittedly 18 months ago we had the seminars, who were very traditionally minded in terms of their media, but there was a sense of we must respond immediately. I mean, from the Today programme through and the internet, and I think he does produce that fault. There are two questions here.
Sorry, Rob McIver. Can I just follow up this point about the business leaders on Twitter? I was very intrigued a couple of days ago to read a quote from Richard Branson, who said that he only started reading his own tweets when he reached 1 million followers, which I think was the same level as Alan Sugar, which struck me as quite a shocking admission that he'd been cheerfully allowing somebody, some minion in his PR department, to send out messages in effect in his name.
That shocked, that shocked you?
It did. Having dealt with Virgin's complaints department, I know that Richard signs off everyone personally. But Jason, going back to John Varley, you may recall, I think possibly after your time at Barclays, that most of the Barclays directors started blogging internally. And I wrote most of them, and John Varley insisted on writing his own. But I wonder what advice you would give to a business leader about the degree to which they should engage with it. Because it does strike me, looking at some of the business blogs, and I'm thinking perhaps of Alan Sugar's one, that it may well be doing more damage than good.
Just behind you.
My name's Helen Goodman, and I am a politician. And I'm probably the worst person in the world
To be a civil servant as well.
to be a civil servant, to comment on this, because at the start of the general election campaign, my friend said to me, Helen, you've got to get on Facebook. And by the end, apart from one person, everybody else was either a friend of my children or another Labour MP. But the point I was going to make relates to what Peter was just saying about whose views we get. So when we had the forests thing, 38 Degrees did a fantastic campaign. You knew what the middle classes thought. But if you're concerned about the treatment of people with disabilities and the benefit system, sorry, this is almost irrelevant. It's not coming through. So it is interesting, and we do need to keep our eye on it, but it does privilege certain sections of the community.
Right. Yeah, if you want to have this question, and then Jason, you do the other one. Yeah.
I know where you're coming from on that, but I have to say, if I do a phone-in subject on my LBC show that is related to some of the subjects that you've just been discussing, and I don't include those in what I'm saying in my sort of opening monologue, or I don't have callers that are representing that viewpoint, believe me, they come on Twitter and tell me about it. And I'm the only presenter on LBC that will have my laptop open in front of me with my TweetDeck there, and I can get instant reaction to what's going on. And people are never backward in coming forward if they think that you're either being biased in a debate or you're not putting their viewpoint forward. And of course, if you then read them out, particularly if they're critical of what you yourself as a presenter are doing, then that encourages a lot more. And particularly on the disability front, I mean, that happens an awful lot. So I think you're slightly exaggerating the case there, if I'm honest.
Jason.
Well, the social media sort of skews towards populist areas. I mean, the fact is that, you know, Starbucks Frappuccinos have more friends on Facebook than Barack Obama. So, you know, that's, you know, that
current polls, that's not surprising.
More likes, sorry, than Barack Obama. But the fact is that if you've got a voice, you should engage. Now, I think for business people, it's a bit like all the way back, if you remember right at the beginning, we were talking about columnists and whether people should have blogs or not, and people who wanted to blog and people who are forced to blog. Now, if you think you've got something to say and you're wanting to share your views, then go out and do it. And I would encourage business people to do it. And it's a very good way of actually directing people to what you're doing, what you want to get out there, so that the people who are basically interested can come and have a look. If you're being forced at a gunpoint or at, withdrawal of your bonus for not tweeting, then you're not comfortable with it. You're not in it. You're going to get a minion to go and write the blog for you, and it'll come out like Dalek speak, and nobody will be particularly interested in it. So the fact is that the only people who should go and tweet and blog are the people who want to do it. But actually, if people think that they should be that they've got something to say, they should damn well get out there, because the more people can connect with either business people or politicians or even civil servants, they'll actually feel like they are actually getting involved and they're actually trusting what these people are doing and actually understanding their motivation.
And in the end, you've got to keep it real.
Yeah.
I mean, if people can spot a fake a mile off, and they can do that on a blog. If you try and pretend you're something you're not, if you exaggerate something, you will be found out about it. I mean, one thing we haven't really talked about is how the social media is actually holding mainstream media to account. The Johan Hari thing would not have happened without the social media. And I mean, Polly Toynbee hates the internet because if she says something wrong, I use her just as a random example. If she says something wrong, somebody somewhere is going to check up on it.
Yeah, could I just add one, before we conclude, one personal note? I used to do the opinion polling for the Times, and there were two websites which analysed it very closely, UK Polling Report and Political Betting. And they really held anyone writing about polling to account. So if there's a slipshod question or interpretation, and that I thought was tremendous. Yeah. And I regarded that as a really good thing, that I knew that one, they'd analyse every poll I wrote about every month or more frequently during elections, and I had a dialogue with them. And it was very productive. I mean, sometimes I didn't agree with the interpretation they made, but they had a dialogue, and they were kind of serious part of it. And that, to my mind, as from a written journalist point of view, was crucial to it. Just finally to say, I think the clear note is actually the interconnection of all the media rather than one mattering more than the others. They interconnect. Yeah. And also how rapidly developing this world is in every respect. Before I thank Jason and Ian, just mention this is the first of a series we're doing with Fishburne Hedges. The next one will be Monday, 5th of December at 6 o'clock, at lunchtime. Policy by Twitter. We shall have James Murdoch's closest friend, Tom Watson, Tim Montgomery, David Babbs from 38 Degrees, and Alberto Nardelli, Tweet Minister. Then the next one will be in January, on Tuesday, 24th of January, again at 6 o'clock, Policy in the Press, with the retired Today journalist Alistair Campbell. I don't know what he did after he left Today.
My stand-in on LBC for one night.
Right, 7 to 10 every evening. Yeah, thanks, Ian. And then in February, we haven't settled the date. The final one will be on the future of regulation, which we're going to have people involved in that debate, and we'll try and also get people, I'm sure, who are involved in the Leveson inquiry, which will then be reaching quite an interesting point. So, on your behalf, I'd very much like to thank Jason Nissy and Ian Dale, as well as the absent and now interviewing John Snow. Thank you very much.